The supply chain leaders who succeed and those ones who probably don't do so well are those ones who can get in, understand what it is we're trying to achieve, bring people into the fold, resource it properly and deliver it, make sure it's handed over to somebody who can do the maintenance, and then move on. What you shouldn't be thinking about doing is, how do I make myself irreplaceable around here? Or I'll do half a solution, but I'll always be ready to jump in and firefight. So I would advise anybody who's trying to build a career in supply chain, or probably any other function, to think, when I'm firefighting, what issue am I leaving on the table that I'm not solving? And I should solve as soon as possible to stop the firefight. Of course, there are exceptions. And if you've got a very well constructed process you're managing, there will be exceptions, and you kind of look at those as exceptions. You don't go and firefight those. So the most important thing here is to understand what it is you're trying to do, resource it with your team, get them in fully engaged in it, complete it, hand it over properly, and then move on to the next challenge.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newberry. I'm a senior executive on call, helping businesses in a make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative, and digital, with thought leaders, experts, and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Sforza, and I'm the Director of Member and Corporate Engagement for Supply Chain Canada, Ontario Institute. Supply Chain Canada is a member-driven, not-for-profit association, and our vision is to ensure Canadian supply chain professionals and organizations are recognized for leading innovation, global competitiveness, and driving economic growth. And thank you for joining us. Thank you also for all the work you're doing during this pandemic to keep our supply chains working in Canada. I'm happy to introduce all of you to Gary Newberry. Gary is a recognized thought leader in the retail supply chain of the future by the Retail Council of Canada and other professional bodies. His 30-year track record of transformational change is notable for rapidly driving underperforming fulfillment facilities, distribution networks, and the last mile to market-leading performance within the complex, fast-moving, and often highly ambiguous retail supply chain environment. Today, Gary will dive into the big impacts on consumer behavior resulting from COVID-19 and the resulting challenges in supply chain, as well as share with us his roadmap to success. Without further ado, I am delighted to welcome Gary.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'm pleased to be able to offer my perspective on a number of areas, and we're going to deal with these three areas today. The first one is just to take a quick look at Canadian consumers and how some of the factors are impacting on them at the moment as a result of COVID-19 and obviously the government's intervention. Look at the Canadian retailing landscape and what might be a platform for Canadian retailers to move forward, and then just reflect on some personal keys for success in supply chain leadership. After each one of those, we'll just have a short break to take any questions relating to that section. So I'm going to launch into what is retailing in terms of its economic impact in Canada, and just talk about very briefly about some of the underlying stats which are quite startling as we enter into and work through this COVID period. So retailing in Canada is approximately 600 billion give or take. I have no idea what it's going to be this year. The whole market's been highly disruptive, but up until 2019, it was broadly about 30% of economic activity. So it's one of the biggest industries, one of the biggest drivers of GDP in Canada. We have quite high income polarization here. We have the top 20% of earners represent something in the order of 67 to 70% of earnings. The next 20% add another 20% to that. And then we drop down to the last 60%, and they represent something like 10% of earning capacity in Canada. A survey done before we went into the lockdown during March said that 49% of Canadians are only $200 away from not being able to pay their bills, from being in a state of financial ruin. And one of the interesting statistics, which Craig Alexander, economist of Deloitte, said, the debt to income ratio, which is pretty high at 1.8 to 1. So for every 1.8 of debt we only earn $1. It was a bit of a dumb statistic, and he didn't go on to say, but I then subsequently scratched the surface, and basically if you're earning up to $60,000 a year, your debt to earnings ratio is in the order of 3.3. So what I'm seeing here is a situation coming out of a great recession going into this great acceleration, or however you want to describe it, this discontinuity event, is the rich are getting richer, getting more debt free, and the poor, or the lower paid people, are getting more and more strangled by debt and poor prospects. There are broadly, depending which statistics you grab hold of and how you amalgamate those, broadly 8 to 9 million Canadians are either unemployed, underemployed, or on what I call life support through CERB during this period. That represents broadly 50% of our working population. So now, just before we move on, it's interesting to see that retail sales growth for 2019 was only 1.6%, which isn't that much different to inflation. And bear in mind, we had something in the order of 300,000 immigrants landing in Canada during that period of time. Retail was looking at a pretty bad shape in 2019 already. And as we went into January, hundreds of storefronts were being closed. Some of that was driven by changes in America, like Pier 1 imports, and some of it was actually home closures. So entering into COVID, we weren't in a particularly strong state. So if we could have the next slide, please. I've been to many consumer behavior webinars, read quite a lot of items, and I've studied consumer behavior itself. But these are 5 key components I believe are going to impact on individual consumers during this time. Isolation. Who in their life has been told stay at home for 3 months, just get on with it, and potentially tackle your work from home, look after your children, home educate them. There's a whole range of things that have fundamentally disrupted the natural flow of things, of working 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, coming home weekends, do shopping, visit family, whatever. That's all been thrown into what I'd call it extreme chaos. And given what I said about the financial capacity of a typical Canadian, half the Canadians are within $200 of being in very difficult trouble, and half of the population also going on to some form of state support, their potential capacity to pay bills after this period of time is going to be very reduced. We have the impact of direct and indirect COVID-19 exposure. What I mean by that is the direct impact is somebody in your household or your extended out of household family or friends contracts the infection, and worst case scenario is that they pass away because of it. Or the indirect impact of COVID through media, press, CB24, constantly looking at developing stories, statistics, social network and conspiracy theories, and there's a lot of fear being stoked up by these forms of how we receive information. The next heading is kind of work. Now, if we're furloughed, laid off for a temporary period of time and gone on to state support, we might have every thought in our mind that we're going to be returning to work at some stage. But if I was laid off from a retailer who's now gone into bankruptcy protection or just going for a store rationalisation, like say if I was in Edmonton and working for HBC, I'd be shocked to hear my store is being closed. I now have a very different scenario to face up to. It's one thing to sit at home and watch Netflix and start to take interest in other things in my life, like gardening and painting the rooms, etc. And all of a sudden, I haven't actually got a forward path on my work situation. And if that's the case, when I think about maybe half the population may also be in a similar situation, it's a very tough competitive market to think about. And when I return to work, say if I work in an office or a warehouse, how is this social distancing going to work out? Am I driving enough fear into myself to say these are going to be very unsafe environments for me to expose myself, because I could bring it home and infect my immediate family? And the one that often doesn't get said so clearly in these sort of webinars and readings is the actual fundamental sense of abundance which has been challenged. I wonder how many of us have actually gone to a grocer and had to queue in 6 feet gaps from each other, waited to get into what I call the decompression area, the entrance to a store, had somebody sort of meter us into the store, like rather than us walking in like we used to. Somebody hands us a wipe down trolley. We have to walk down aisles in a certain way. We can't come to shelves, they're still empty after 2 or 3 months into the situation, and there's still limits on certain commodities, certain things that we'd shop for, like maybe toilet roll. When we come to till up, there's some plastic between me and the tiller, and sometimes those people cashiering don't pack your bags anymore, and they're wearing gloves and masks. And it's a very different scenario shopping now than it was even 3 months ago. So all these things are contriving to deeply influence future consumer behavior. And the important thing to recognize here is nobody knows how all these components and the other ones that I haven't mentioned are all going to concoct in such a way that consumers will start to behave very differently to what they were doing in January and February this year. So if I can have the next slide, please, Kim. There are some areas, and I'm just going to run through it very quickly, but one of the big areas that many of us in the supply chain will in some ways relieved about, because we would be talking about automation and automation of our fulfillment facilities, warehouses, and we would be talking about it, would be very apprehensive about making too much store about it. But now, if we think about some of the warehouses and some of the manufacturing plants, we've thrown people into, and I'm using that term euphemistically, they've got infected, we've had to close a factory or close down the warehouse or even close down the store. We're starting to be able to say, hey, look, we can actually get these people, retrain them, do something else, and we ought to have automation in these environments because it's actually could be quite risky for our people. So we can actually now have those conversations more openly. I think there's more public acceptance of things like automation, RPA, robotic process automation, and using AI to help guide us in the future. The adaptation of traditional channels of consumption, an example of that would be virtual tools or even Zoom. I know that we've had platforms like Zoom, but everybody seems to have jumped onto Zoom and let's Zoom each other. And this is changing how we interact with each other during this time. And I think quite a lot of these things will continue beyond when we've reopened, when we've found a vaccine. Some of these things we've experienced will continue. There is a narrative about everything's going digital, everything's going online. Well, that may be true. A lot of people have been forced online, but I have to say that their experience of online has been somewhat disappointing, right from the extremes of Amazon's next day has gone to next month. Certainly during the lockdown period, I stopped ordering on Amazon because I wasn't going to wait a month for something, which I could get from an alternative store. But some of the click and collect performances of retailers have really not made a mark and their home delivery, there's normally some kind of payment involved, and there's unpredictability. I place my order assuming I can place my order. Some of the sites were actually offline for placing orders, let alone processing the orders. So this whole narrative about everything's gone digital, I think that we just need to step back, see what happens when the stores reopen, and find out, is there been a more permanent shift to digital? And it should encourage retailers to do a much better job of their whole digital fulfillment strategies. But the categories that seem to be moving in the right direction, or more positively than they have done in the past, and leaving quite a lot of other categories in their wake, are things to do with health and well-being. Things like gym equipment, because you can't go out, you might as well get the Peloton thing downstairs and start using that. Things around your home that you wouldn't necessarily think about. If you're remote working, you may actually have to invest in a decent chair, a decent desk, maybe some more equipment, some more screens. You might suddenly realize that actually cooking's not so bad, so you need to get some more utensils and stuff, and you suddenly take an interest, especially with the summer turning on a little bit earlier than it was last year. You may start going, hey, I want to be planting flowers and doing gardening jobs, because you're pretty much confined to home. And following on from that point about remote working, do we think as a collective that remote working is here to stay? It may not be in the concentration that we've had because of the circumstances, but I think that we'll find that in the kind of rush to save more cost, why would we bring hundreds of people in between 9 and 5 to travel into town centres, into difficult places to access normally, sit them in an office, stand over them, wag the finger, get them to be productive, when we can see a real-time experiment of actually dispersing these people, leaving them at home, linking them up to VPNs and stuff, and doing remote working. And as a benefit of this, is the environment actually clearing up because of this? And if we do another 10 weeks, another 100 weeks, will it increasingly get cleared up? Or have we already got to like the 10 weeks and it doesn't get to be much better than this in terms of the environmental impact of us not traveling so much, not putting so much pollution into the atmosphere? And I think that we will be committed, I hope, to more preparation for future pandemics and situations of that nature. Having proper PPE in place, having respirators and any other kind of pieces of equipment which other pandemics may require. Have we got our hospital capacities properly organised? And I think we'll probably be more ready to make those investments as a country to avoid what we've just been through. So if I just have the next slide, and I'm just going to throw it open to any questions that may have occurred.
Terabo Douglas, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Gary. Thank you for the presentation. I think this is not a question, but it's more a comment. I think the fine line for us will be to find the balance where we're able to harness from some of the, irrespective of the COVID-19, we can see some silver lining in it, where you're talking about how we can minimize our footprints, more people can work from home. But the difficulty will be with people in the workforce who aren't so savvy with the new technology. Remember that I work for a government organization, so I'll say all the staff were still trying to grapple with having to work from home. I know that some of my colleagues that are much older are complaining about the screen, some of the technology they have to use. So I think the balance will be how we can incorporate these older workforce while getting some of the gains from having to work from home, being more efficient when it comes to lease agreements. Some organizations, I'm sure, are already thinking about their real estate financial obligations and things like that.
Yeah,
so thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that companies, imagine you're trying to recruit and you can only recruit through virtual channels. You can't actually recruit in person. Companies are finding ways around this, using Zoom to do their things. And the good thing about Zoom is that rather than waiting for the guys to come in from Detroit, we can actually get them all on the same, not on the same platform at the same time. They can, can have a big panel interview and just try and crunch through this recruitment thing. You're right that there are technology issues and technology training issues, but I think that the common belief has been that we have to have people in the office so we can wag the finger over and get them productive, and we've proven probably there are some people who can't easily adjust to working at home. They actually yearn to actually drive to somewhere and sit in the office for sure, but the majority of people actually, the reports I've read, are they're pretty productive. In fact, they're doing more than, if they're sitting at their desk for 8 hours, they're actually doing a lot more work than they would have ever achieved sitting in the office and obviously having conversations and doing social things and meeting at the coffee dispenser, etc. So there is some things that are of benefit of remote working. The thing that has to be dealt with is that social dimension. How do firms, if they want to lose the office and the cost of that office and provide that time back to people, how do they make that social dimension of working together collaboratively over the internet? How does that work? And they're still going to come up with innovation and new schemes to be able to do that. I'm kind of conscious of time, so shall we move on?
Yes, we're good. Thank you, Taribo. We'll move on to the second segment.
Thank you. I just wanted to give a perspective, and bear in mind that I'm quite retail centric, and hopefully we can have a wider point about other industries. But I'm going to talk about Canadian retailing, that from post World War II and rationing and reconstruction and stuff like that, out emerged from the general store, which may or may not have been some kind of national regional chain, came the department store. And it was a jewel of retailing. It was kind of where you could get everything for your household, apparel, furniture, probably washing machines, and you could just go to one place, order it, may have may make the delivery to your home, or you just pick it up, chuck it in the back of your trunk, and on your way home. Alongside that was the mall. Now the mall was a natural progression of a department store because it had all the individual categories represented by individual banners, whereas a department store was lots of different brands supported by one banner, like HBC, versus going to a local mall where if you take out the anchor stores and say what's in this, it'd be loads of apparel retailers, some furniture, some bedding, stuff. So we had the rise of the mall and the rise of a department store, but weirdly the department stores jumped into the mall because they perhaps were attracted by good traffic flow, good number of customers passing their door, but they were right head to head with their competitors at a category level. And I think the only thing that steered them that way was the space that they used was going to be cheaper than the individual other retailers. What retailers have been doing since the World War, and certainly the last 15 years has been an extension of this, is go large, which is my shorthand for we want more stores, we want bigger stores, we want more stuff in the stores, so proliferating the product. Now, as you go through, like if you try to dominate a country, there'll be a point in time where you become overstored and you get diminishing returns. And so to try to recognize that, and I think this may have been slightly misrecognized as we're reaching diminishing returns, so we have to find some way of keeping cash in the business. So how do we do that? Oh, let's find things cheaply. Let's buy things that are made in countries with a lower cost of production. Let's chop our service in the store. Let's take out sales associates, so let the customer serve themselves. Let's put in self-serving tills and stuff like that. What I think, generally speaking, retailing here and in other parts of the world has done is they haven't really realized their retail concept life cycle. They've misinterpreted the signals in some ways, and it didn't help that we had a great recession, which changed consumers from being actually quite, I wouldn't say conspicuously consuming things like people with like big cars, label, designer wear. And those same people, having gone through and suffered maybe through the Great Recession, suddenly became great advocates of Walmart, Dollarama, the value end of the market. And the children that accompanied those to the stores, typically now the millennials, have been brought up in an age of high value, things where the value is more important than anything else of a price. So retail has been sort of misinterpreting the signal. They've cut their prices. They've done this race to the bottom. If you follow anything in retail, you'll see people quoting this, race to the bottom. They've cut out inventory. They've made themselves quite vulnerable. The thing is, they haven't really transformed themselves for the digital age, which is sometimes called a digital transformation. And similarly, they have not introduced digitization at scale across their networks, so they could deliver deep personalization. This is the concept of omnichannel, is to deliver a deeply personal experience for each individual consumer. And as a result of that, none of them really can claim to be customer centric. So I think that for me, the epitaph of, from the Great Recession, into the Great Recession to February this year, the epitaph for that period is really caught chasing shiny nickels. They're like the snake oil of somehow we're going to provide a solution for you, which is going to drop your costs down so that you can carry on trading. And even if they bought that and even had a vision as to what that path might be, that roadmap to success, I think in general terms, and there are exceptions to this, their ability to execute on a plan has been somewhat missing, to say the least. So we arrive as a whole team of retailers at the start of COVID, and we've all suffered shocks. So next slide, please, Kim. I got together with a whole bunch of top quality Canadian retailers and said, what happens next? Where are we? What happens next? And we had a couple of days of really deep discussions, and I said I'd write up a report, and I wish I hadn't, because there were so many diverse thoughts and sort of paradigms almost, that it was a chore, to say the least. But we ended up landing on 3 discrete processes or stages. The first one was just do it, which is pretty obvious what it is. It's keep those shelves full. Or if you're a non-essential retailer, which the apparel retailers were to start with, and they were joined by many other categories of retailers, it was like, get the click and collect working fast. If it's working, can you scale it? If it's not working, get it up and running. For those businesses that perhaps, or retailers that did it from a warehouse, it were probably somewhat more advantageous than actually from stores, which were locked inside malls. So even if they had a store-based digital fulfillment strategy, if they were in a mall, it didn't make any difference because they didn't have a solution. Alongside that, not after this, many retailers I've spoken to are seeing these 3 processes as a serial thing, whereas just do it and transform boldly and quickly a parallel thing. So as most of the management emphasis is getting those shelves full, if you're in a grocery or pharmacy, it is to actually stand back and say, okay, how do we change our business model? What do we need to do around here? How do we reassign our basic core function to, say, marketing, of merchandising, of store network, of digital, supply chain? How do we reorientate that? How do we change our culture to reward the right type of performances? What do our processes need to look like? How's our existing technology going to be reconfigured to actually support these new processes, these new capabilities, to allow us, as these consumers emerge from their kind of period of isolation, they wobble out of that in some way, say, no, I have to go shopping again, but I'm not sure if it's safe to go back shopping yet. I need to know who's open, if it's safe, before I actually make that transition. So we develop capabilities that we can and then move into the 3rd stage, is to adapt those capabilities. And we have to let go of the processes which got us to here, but not necessarily we want to continue with. So that there would be the 3 stages. The first 2 are kind of in parallel. And my argument here is, I had this argument several times with other people, which is that they've been saying that, oh, we need to bring in new blood as we develop the roadmap and implement it. And I say, well, no, I actually think we need new blood at the start of this transformational process. On the basis that Einstein said, the thinking that got us into this problem isn't the thinking that's going to get us out of this problem. I think we need new perspectives at that stage where they're trying to look at their business model again, look at how they need to restructure their organization, what's going to be important around here, and then allow those people as transformational people, with people who are skilled at reinvention, to actually run down that roadmap, implement, and have these capabilities ready, so that when the consumers start to flock back either digitally or via store, we're in a good position that we can adapt those capabilities. Because if we try to believe that we haven't really developed any great capabilities over the last 15 years, maybe, if we haven't got those kind of capabilities that can pivot, then we're going to be in a real competitive disadvantage, because those retailers who are thinking this process and working this process through to a point where they relaunch their banner, then we haven't got really much we can adapt. It's just like, just try and change that process just a little bit. Whereas the guys who've gone through this really concentrated, accelerated, transformational step are really in a good shape. But I have to say, and put my hand up, is that I don't see too much evidence that many retailers are actually working through this. The ones that I've talked to are going to just do it, transform bold and quickly, and adapt. So they're going to basically keep quite a lot of what they're already doing. Transformation is really a quasi step for just saying adapt what we've got. So it's an interesting period of time for retailers as they start to reopen. You'll see in Ontario, we had a revision of the essential businesses, and people like Home Depot, Lowe's, and Canadian Tire threw their doors open, had a few markers on the floor, and basically it's back to business as usual, except that there's a release of how many people you can have in the store at any one time, and you've got to clean things up more regularly, more deeply. But it's really, in essence, back to normal. And if you follow my logic and say that we missed the boat and retail was in a bad shape anyway, it was losing increasing relevance, certainly at banner level, that's not really a good place to be in. So I'll just leave it there, and I think I'm just about to open up to questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. I have a question for you. Can you share an example of what companies are doing right in the face of COVID-19 to adapt their business processes while meeting the unpredictable consumer demand? So have you come across some that are really have done something impressive and have inspired you?
No, not yet, but I would say this. I was shocked by when I was reading through my daily e-zines that Aldo went into, because I just read the top headline and I was a bit shocked by it, and it said Aldo's going into bankruptcy, but I missed protection. So I went into a flat spin, thought, I didn't even see that coming. I saw Reitman's coming because I studied that company in some detail over the last 10 years, but Aldo, this is an international brand. This is one of our top retail brands here in Canada, which is paraded internationally and very successful. And for that to, I saw it going into bankruptcy. And then I stood back and found out exactly what bankruptcy protection means in this country, because we have different languaging in the UK for that. Basically, they've actually taken a very positive step. They are going to restructure their business. They are going to get rid of their overstored capacity. They will probably bring in a new product range, a new proposition. They will go through the reinvention with the protection that creditors aren't going to pull the rug on them and send them into insolvency. So I think that's a very bold move. It's like a first mover advantage. They will probably emerge during later this year much stronger, much leaner, more purposeful than those retailers who are just slinging open their doors and just hoping it will somehow come right. But you have other things like south of the border, JCPenney, who I wrote about on LinkedIn, that they have had years and years of change of management, change of strategy, and whatever. They've landed in creditor protection, but I don't think they're going to emerge. They're going to shed stores, and there's some rumor that Amazon might take those stores and actually start to, and they're mostly mail-based stores, and they're going to start to ingress across the whole mall and may take over malls in across America and try to convert those into a new type of shopping experience where there's a big element of fulfillment to home delivery and click and collect services, but also converting some of the banners inside the mall to B2C models and offering those banners services via a bit like rather than a virtual marketplace, an actual marketplace. So if you can imagine what Amazon do to third-party sellers, the third-party sellers will be visibly in the mall and they'll be doing all their fulfillment for them. So yeah, Amazon are doing things quietly in the background, but in Canada, I see Aldo is doing something quite strong-minded, because they're putting their whole brand on the line by making this step change. But many other retailers, just as I say, just slinging the doors open and just hoping it was just a bad dream. It's not a bad dream. It's a period of acceleration, and if you are in a weak position, you've got a poor balance sheet, your proposition is becoming increasingly irrelevant. This is almost dead man walking.
Oh, well, it's interesting times. We have a question from Irene Jumbo. Irene, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi.
Hi, Irene.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you so much, Gary, for your presentation. My question is, I heard a lot of transformation, and transformation requires leadership. And with every crisis, there's opportunity, like you said. How can supply chain professionals, especially ICMP in different organizations, position themselves as the solution leaders?
It's a great question, and I hope that I'm going to deal with that very shortly. It's in my next section. I will say, as a prelude to just taking us through the next couple of slides, is that I've been saying for several years now that every organization, of course I'm retail centric, so I'll say every retailer, but I would make a more general point. Every retailer should have a chief supply chain officer who sits on the C-suite, who guides and helps management teams to make more informed, better decisions. In the world of retail, I see a very clear separation of functions. I see marketing at the top. Traditionally, marketing has been to the side. It's the guys who do the marketing comms, get the flyer out every week. Marketing should be at the pinnacle, the top of the organization. The bits in the middle, the selling, the selling being like digital channels or the store, and the buying, the merchandising should be that level in the middle, and everything else should be the supply chain. When we get to that kind of a structure, when we actually get we separate all the different fragmented bits of the supply chain into one cogent whole, we start to see the whole, the arena of a supply chain and how it can be weaponized to provide competitive advantage. At the moment, many retailers sort of smuggle bits of, demand planning, allocations, the warehouse, the transportation, the last mile, the digital last mile, I should say. If you looked at an organizational structure and then asked people to elucidate how it actually works, they'd find that much of the activity in the supply chain is actually in merchandising, when it should be kind of grappled out maybe and put into a formal supply chain thing. Because at the end of the day, the merchandiser should be reacting to marketing leaders to this is what the product assortment needs to look like, and merchandising people will fill in the gaps and then work on general assortment planning and demand forecasting. But at that level, then they hand it over to the supply chain. It's our job in supply chain to take those marching instructions and execute those flawlessly. I hope I answered your question. I went off on a slight tangent, I think.
Well, I think we will touch on that a little more, as you alluded to in the next slides. We have one more question before we move on to the next segment. I'm going to ask Alizar Kalfan. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Gary. Can you hear me?
So again,
Perfect. Gary, thank you first and foremost for doing this presentation. Very insightful. I will ask a question on behalf of some of our members, particularly with the shift now moving towards e-commerce. A lot of retailers are lagged behind and are now trying to play catch up, but in the process, they're losing a lot of money and they're not yet profitable. But to your earlier slide, you just you can't wait for the perfect evidence-based case study to move ahead. So what are you noticing that will hopefully change in the coming months that will make these retailers more profitable when it comes to their e-commerce portfolio?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because one of the top secrets of e-commerce is there are two big elements of cost. One is the cost of customer acquisition. We sometimes forget to talk about, especially when we're in the supply chain, where we think that the customers arrive, they place their orders, but the advertising, the marketing comms, etc., and the maintenance of social networks to try and generate interest and using social influences and the like, that's a huge cost. Then we have the actual fulfillment of picking singles, put them in the box, put them on a truck, whether or not it's our truck or a small package carrier, and then getting that to the home. More often than not, consumers haven't been educated by people like Amazon, have come to expect delivery is free and returns are free. And the whole retail ethos up to this point has been, do you know what? We buy big truckloads from CPGs, we bring them into our big DCs, we put them in a rack, we drop them down, we pick a layer, we put it on another pallet, we build that pallet up, we build loads of pallets, put them on a big truck, send them to the store. Oh, we have to do singles. Ah, right, so guess what? Unless we automate that process, we have to have a team of people working in horizontally organized racking, because they can't actually reach much more than 6 feet, going picking singles. I mean, that's an incredibly expensive piece of work. And if you do it in a store base, at least in a warehouse, you start with your fast movers and work down the aisle to your slow movers. But in a store, you've got an arrangement where it's what you call class. So a class or category might be, tomato sauces, and you've got a subclass of, big, small, or large kind of thing. And then next to that will be the salad creams, and the next one to that might be, Piccadilly sauce. I wouldn't organize a warehouse like that. So whichever way a retailer will look at this within their current mindset, they will face a situation of very high costs. Now, I've been arguing for some time, and there's some evidence from the experience of Target, as their businesses move more to digital during this shutdown period. Although their digital volumes have gone up by 140 odd %, their costs have actually gone up a lot faster than that. And it kind of leaked out a little bit, and they've tried to put somewhat of a spin on it, because they've had a good track record of delivering good digital fulfillment strategies. But I think that there's some vagaries in how we account for things that allow that at a small volume we seem to be okay, but as soon as we get to a bigger volume, the accountants look at this in a different way and say, hey, there's more costs in there than we thought. And depending on the method of fulfillment, whether it's from a warehouse, from a dropship program, or from in-store, and whether that is in-store picking or some version of backroom sortation, the cost will suddenly become apparent. In our race to try to get to critical mass, which is normally a figure higher than now, actually, I think the critical mass of e-commerce for most retailers is probably negative, so don't do it. Would be a good start. And if you have to do it, make sure you charge for it, so that if a customer wants to have that home delivery, that they have to pay for transportation and the picking of that. And I think at the moment retailers are ill-equipped to really understand the cost of a last mile fulfillment.
Great question. Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you.
So Gary, I think we're ready to move on to our final segment.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I've had a couple of meetings with Argentis, and I recommend anybody to read their
monthly
blog. It tends to turn up in my inbox. I had an interview with them from a retail supply chain point of view, what makes for a good chief supply chain officer or supply chain leader in November. And as this COVID thing broke and we went into lockdown, we had another conversation, and I started to think about really the big challenges ahead. What do we need from our supply chain leaders of the future, or immediacy and the future? And there were 5 key themes that emerged from those discussions. The first one is transformational leadership skills. Now, I guess if you go to anybody on LinkedIn who wants to be relevant at the moment, they say, well, I'm a transformational person. You changed a few things, great. Or I've implemented a new system. The transformational journey happens slightly different to that in some ways. So what is transformational leadership skills? And this is the thing that's often not understood. There is a degree of visionary zeal and charisma that needs to be embedded into this skill set, that you're able to vision very clearly what the company or the supply chain needs to look like. You have to be able to convert that idea into a series of communication with maybe your fellow executives, your team, and engage them in a process where they learn what that means by experimenting, typically failing fast, but learning faster. And then when people have got enough momentum and trust in the vision, they start moving. Your job is to fully engage with them and empower them to move forward with the vision and actually implement that vision. It's quite different in some ways to just saying you've implemented the system, because it doesn't always mean that you've gone through that visioning stage and taken people across the company into that journey. The second one is I call it project based, and you could maybe sneak into the project management based mindset, but I'd take that out a little bit just to make the point more clear. And I think if you're a supply chain leader in any sort of role within your supply chain structure, there'd be things that you've got, kicking around in your head, projects you've got going on, initiatives, things that you need to, continuous improvement things going on. And I think that the ones that the supply chain leaders who succeed and those ones who probably don't do so well are those ones who can get in, understand what it is we're trying to achieve, bring people into the fold, resource it properly and deliver it. Make sure it's handed over to somebody who can do the maintenance, and then move on. What you shouldn't be thinking about doing is, how do I make myself irreplaceable around here? Or I'll do half a solution, but I'll always be ready to jump in and firefight. So I would advise anybody who's trying to build a career in supply chain, or probably any other function, to think, when I'm firefighting, what issue am I leaving on the table that I'm not solving, and I should solve as soon as possible to stop the firefight. Of course, there are exceptions, and if you've got a very well constructed process you're managing, there will be exceptions, and you kind of look at those as exceptions. You don't go and firefight those. So the most important thing here is to understand what it is you're trying to do, resource it with your team, get them fully engaged in it, complete it, hand it over properly, and then move on to the next challenge. The other item is with the amount of, I wouldn't say uncertainty that we're facing now, and whatever we think about right now, the future will be even more uncertain than it is right now. And it's never been this certain, but the future will be much more uncertain than it is today. So we have this term VUCA, and I think that you've probably had people mention this before, but it's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. These are all kind of dimensions of this general malaise of, we're not quite sure where we're going. And I think we need to link this in with not only being okay about dealing with volatility, which is the kind of trying to understand the amplitude. If we look at demand, looking at the different amplitude, and the frequency of that amplitude varies is one version of volatility. We need to really develop our emotional intelligence skills to be okay about this whole thing, and make our team okay about this thing. Because it's all right if you're a confident leader, you say, yeah, I can handle this, I know how to handle these things. But if your team's like scared to bits, then it's not good. So VEI helps you to bring your team with you to say, hey, we've got a whole period of uncertainty ahead of us. How are we going to fix this within ourselves? How are we going to handle this and get a good result from this? I think being objectively or independently minded. Now, I've had a number of conversations with different retailers, and depending on who I'm talking to, I can hear the stories they've been told by their people from stores, or even their chief executive have told them, oh gosh, it's Amazon, they're killing our business, they're terrible. And I have to stand back and say, well, I wouldn't wear that excuse. So George Minakakis, who I follow, and a good friend of mine, wrote recently in his most up-to-date book, I think it's called A Great Transition, competitors are not the enemy, the inability to create trends is. And I think that sentence in itself, which was smuggled in with some other great pearls of wisdom, was so profound that it certainly set me on the right course, which said that we can blame the weather, Amazon, COVID, whatever, for our poor performance. But the underlying thing is, are we competent? Have we got the skills? Have we got the right type of leadership that can take us forward? So having that independence of mindset will allow us to discern when we've just been fed a story to make it okay for us to underperform, versus, yes, we're on the right track, but we're having some obstacles, but we can work together to move us forward. And under the, I've called it the paradigm flexible. So you've got your objective mindset, but also you've got to be mindful that as we go through a vision, we will have to change our culture, what's rewarded around here, what good looks like, and we have to be flexible to make sure that we contribute to the future success. But independently is cut out the excuses. Paradigm flexible is like working towards a future. And the most important, I think, quality that we can have as individuals in the supply chain team, as leaders, as executives, is, for goodness sake, be authentic, be yourself. Don't try and put on a false face, especially during these times. People want leaders they can trust, they have confidence in. And a confident leader doesn't mean you know all the answers. It means that you're okay, that you don't know the answer, and you're prepared to say, really, I don't know these answers, but we're going to give it a good time, and maybe even open up the forum to discussion. Look, this is where we're thinking we get into, but there's some grey areas. Anybody got any ideas? And teams that get that kind of treatment always respond typically very, very well. And I would say that you can never over communicate, and during this time, especially if you're working through the just do it mode still, or some version of that you can never over communicate if it means hourly briefings, how we're doing, where we're going, what the obstacles, what we're doing about those obstacles. Just keep people involved, and that they will want to follow confident, authentic, honest, truthful, mindful leaders. Probably all, these are the top 5 things that came to mind from those two meetings with Argentis. So I'm going to throw it open to questions, and I'll try and brace myself for some of the things that might come out now.
It's 5 to 5, so we have time for a couple of questions. Alizar Kalfan, would you like to comment again?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Gary, as you talk about leadership skills, I think going back to the last question related to our designation holders, what advice would you give them? What advice or suggestion would you provide by way of our members and those on the call to just be courageous enough or brave enough to sort of be able to ask these tough questions and lead their teams as you've outlined?
Yeah, I think in the question there's the answer, which is those qualities of being courageous, of having the confidence to, try it in a soft way, and then build on that. Have some small success and then build on that. So the people who are going to succeed through COVID and beyond are those ones who are, I would say, it's slightly unconventional in their approach. I know that there's strong hierarchical structures here, and people don't take kindly to people doing slightly different things, or not talking out of turn, but taking stands in different ways than they normally are able to cope with. But I think be brave, be courageous, and have confidence that if you're technically strong, you've picked the right point, and the point you're making will advantage the supply chain or the business. If it's a business, even better. But sometimes you just have to think more parochial. If you can find a way of changing something relatively small to start with, if you've not done it before, but if you've done it before, keep going, and you will be noticed for your independence. Nobody wants, especially during these challenging times, there's a certain amount of thing, like if I'm running a warehouse and working 24/7 and I want people to do things, sometimes, yes, people are great to have around. You just go and pick faster, go and load faster, whatever it is. But if you're the leader of that section, you say, look, boss, we can work faster, but we need these things. And I want to help you to get me these things to load faster, or more equipment, or whatever it might be. But be bold. Just it doesn't mean be arrogant or be aggressive. It just means take the first step, take the lead on this subject. Don't leave your boss to be purveyor of everything and the only person that's right around here. Just go for it. If you know the subject matter, that we're heading in the wrong path, be bold. Just say this is not the right path, and always offer an alternative solution.
Excellent advice. Thank you. Okay, well, that wraps up our session for this evening then. And I would like to thank you, Gary, for sharing so many valuable insights with us today. We really appreciate the time you spent, and I wish everyone a good evening and good health. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of his experiences. Excellent. Take care, everyone. Bye now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.